Well, we know about lithium, cobalt, nickel, silver even, but what about manganese, the forgotten EV battery metal? We're here to discuss this with Andrew Zemek. He is the special advisor to the CPM Group. Andrew, welcome to the show. Welcome to Kitco. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, welcome, David. Thank you for having me. That's my first time with Kitco, so I'm naturally nervous with such an audience.
Well, I mean, look, first time, but definitely not the last, so no need to be nervous. You are a wealth of knowledge. The question on everybody's mind right now is, what is manganese? Let's start with that.
Right. I usually say the manganese is the forgotten battery metal. And this is a bit of an oxymoron because manganese has been with us since the beginning of the lithium-ion batteries, since 2008, when the first NMC chemistry made headlines. Manganese was part of it, but somehow people didn't talk about it. They talked about lithium in 2000s, and then they talked about cobalt and nickel in 2010s. And now I'm telling you, for the next 10 years, people will be talking about manganese, and you are about to find out why.
Well, okay. Well, let's talk about why. Manganese, it's a chemical compound. Am I correct?
Now, the manganese itself is a metal. Except that what is used in the batteries is the compound. And one of the reasons that it's being overlooked is because it is essentially a metal used for making steel. 90% of manganese mined in the world today is going to produce steel. Yeah. And this is obviously the market in its own right, and it's interesting and so on, but it's not as sexy and not as hot, definitely, as...
Well, let's take a step back because, like your report mentioned, now not all the manganese that is being mined and produced is used for electric vehicles and battery production. Some have industrial applications outside of EVs. For example, agriculture is a big use of manganese, am I correct?
That is correct, yes. The manganese in the same chemical format as the one used in batteries, that is manganese sulfate, a salt of manganese metal, is predominantly used in agriculture as a cattle feed supplement, as a fertilizer component, as components of fungicides and pesticides and so on. So these were the traditional applications of the manganese sulfate. And today, manganese sulfate of high purity, of exceptionally high purity, is predominantly going into electric vehicle batteries, or generally speaking, lithium-ion batteries, rechargeable batteries. But when we talked about, watch batteries or calculator batteries or even phone batteries, not much of it was used. When we start talking about electric vehicles batteries, we are talking something like, 90 kilo of manganese per vehicle. Wow. So that's a very significant proportion. And no wonder the demand is about to balloon.
Okay. How heavy is a battery in an EV?
A battery pack in an electric vehicle could be as heavy as 500 kilos, so 1,000 pounds, if you like.
500 kilos. So with 90 kilos in a car, are you telling me almost 1/5 of the battery weight is manganese?
That is correct, yes. And it's going to be even more in the future.
What is the role of manganese in the vehicle itself? What does it do?
The manganese in the battery is essentially bringing stability. I like to call it, it's Mr. Stable, both in the chemistry, marriage, and in prices, of which we will be talking about in a minute. It helps to bring the temperature down. It helps to the current flow. To a large extent, these are similar properties as those of cobalt, and in the best of worlds, they work together, cobalt and nickel. Then we have those batteries called NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt, and to most people, they just know that they have a lithium-ion battery, but they come in different flavors. And one of these flavors is called NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt. And typically, the cobalt and manganese would be there in the same proportion, like, the same amount of cobalt and the same amount of manganese. Except that cobalt is problematic for both market reasons and geopolitical reasons.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's talk about electric vehicles. The demand for electric vehicles has been growing. You're talking to me about a ballooning of the demand, I think were your words. So where do you see the demand for electric vehicles going in the next, let's say, 10 to 15 years? Given that in the UK where you're based, I think there is a ban on the sale of gas-powered vehicles by 2035, if I'm not mistaken. Several other jurisdictions around the world are following suit. What does this mean for EVs?
That's correct. Well, that's an entirely different discussion altogether about, where is the vehicle market going? Are those forecasts we hear all around of, double-digit, triple-digit growth of electric vehicle market? Is it going to be sustainable? It certainly is happening now. This year, 2021 had 100% growth in electric vehicle sales over the year before. It's certainly going to grow significantly. But I don't really want to go into this particular discussion during this conversation. I want to focus on this particular metal, manganese. And the reason for that is that the whole battery industry, it's being steered towards manganese. And the main reason for it is cobalt. Because cobalt, which is, if you like, an engineer's dream, battery engineer's dream, it mostly comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. 65 to 70% of manganese, of cobalt used today in batteries is coming from that country. And this is not the most stable country in the world. There are logistical problems, there are political problems, there are civil war problems, and so on. So and the prices are extremely volatile. The cobalt is expensive. It's between 10 and 47 times more expensive than manganese is. So no wonder that battery engineers were trying to, quote unquote, engineer cobalt out of batteries. And a lot of effort went into investigations. Can manganese become the new cobalt, if you like? Mm-hmm. And they succeeded. To a large extent, they succeeded. And what we are seeing is a definite shift towards manganese. And in the last 12 months or so, we had what I call the vote for manganese from very big names like Tesla, like Volkswagen, like Stellantis. Stellantis is the merger of Fiat Chrysler with the GM Group, which happened early in 2020. All of these companies, the three I mentioned, between them, they manufacture some 16 million vehicles today. They said publicly, openly, that they are going to bank on manganese batteries for what they call volume segment of the market. So they will use a variety of batteries for their vehicles, but the bulk of them will be based on manganese, one way or another.
So given that more demand for manganese is to be expected from all these factors that you've mentioned, what about the supply? Do we have ample supply to meet this demand?
The supply of manganese is a strange thing. When you are talking about manganese mining, yes, there's plenty of it. It's plenty mined to about 20 million tons per annum. And we have enough resources and reserves to mine for another 300 years at today's production levels. So from that point of view, there is no shortage of manganese. However, what the battery maker requires is not the manganese ore, of course. It's a specific form of manganese. And to be precise, it's manganese sulfate. And to be even more precise, it's a high purity manganese sulfate. And the production conversion facilities for these particular product are quite limited. So they are sufficient for now, for today, but for tomorrow they are inadequate. And the project pipeline is rather thin.
Okay, so is there a potential risk of a major shortage down the line?
This is what we see. And the reason I'm saying this is not just because there are just a few projects right now in the pipeline, but because of the development time and the approval time. The battery makers, they are very picky. They are choosy. They will take new suppliers. They will ask them to jump through many hoops. And it will take 2 to 3, even to 4 years to get approved. And this process of approval can only start when the potential new supplier has enough battery powder or any battery component to supply several hundreds of kilograms of samples. To be able to do that, they need to build a pilot plant capable of doing this. To do that, they need to prepare their mining operation, buy the land, got the permits, environmental permits, and the rest of it. And it all takes time. So when we look at the current project pipeline and the stages these projects are at, we see that there will be like too little, too late compared to what the battery industry would want. Mm-hmm. So that is why we see this shortage developing.
Okay, I'm going to show two charts on the screen now. These are price charts. Before we show the charts, they're slightly different things. Can you help us define the difference between a manganese flake and manganese sulfate?
Right. The manganese flake is a pure manganese metal. It comes in very thin flakes, like 1-2 millimeter thick, very brittle, and it usually contains 99.7 or 99.9% manganese. So it's pure manganese metal. Manganese sulfate is a salt of manganese. It has a physical form of pink crystals, and it's essentially a powder. And what a battery maker needs is the powder. So why do we talk about the metal at all? Because the best way to make the powder is to take the metal and dissolve it in the sulfuric acid and then precipitate it, and you get the powder. There is also a possibility to make powder directly from the ore. So if you like, there are two routes to the form of manganese which is required by the battery maker. Hence, we call both of these products potential sources of manganese for battery makers. We call them collectively as high purity manganese.
Yes.
But the metal is also used in metallurgy, in special steels and special alloys and aluminum alloys and so on as an additive. So the metal has those two applications. One of them is in batteries, which is lesser application and bigger application in metallurgy. The sulfate itself is mostly used in batteries.
Andrew, let's take a look at these price charts here. So both the sulfate and the flake, the manganese flake, have risen dramatically in price over 2021. Taking a look at manganese flake first, we see that around January 2021, the price was roughly $2,000 a ton and closed at over $6,800, or just exactly $6,800 at the end of the year. So that's more than a 3 times increase, almost a 4 times increase, 3.5. Now, manganese sulfate also saw a dramatic rise in prices, starting from around $900 a ton, all the way up to $1,500 a ton. So first of all, what drove the price movement of both the manganese flake and the manganese sulfates? And second, why do we see a slight divergence in prices between these two?
Right. Let's start with the metal first. That's the combination of two factors, essentially. One factor is still quite strong demand from the steel sector, particularly stainless steel, which is the main consumer of manganese metal. But the second one is changes in the manganese industry in China. At the beginning of 2020, the major Chinese manganese producers signed a so-called cooperation agreement, very quickly nicknamed the cartel. Obviously, they don't like the name. But this, in essence, caused a concentration of production and some problems with supply, combined with the big demand from the steel industry. Price went up. So that's the main reason for the price spike in the metal. The price spike in the sulfate is for a different reason, if you like. There is a relationship between the two, but it's rather vague. The spike in prices of manganese sulfate is purely and squarely a result of the growing demand from the battery industry and the deficit, which is becoming more and more obvious.
Okay, let's talk about the price spike and how that relates to EV prices. I think people watching this may be concerned about the rise in prices of all goods. And of course, we've seen the rise in prices of trucks and semiconductors And of course, electric vehicles over the last year, most of that has to do with supply shortages of chips. But now you're telling me that a critical battery component, manganese, which accounts for almost a fifth of the weight of the battery, has risen 3.5 times in the last year in price. Do you see a scenario in which EVs could become way too expensive because of this issue?
Not because of manganese, and I tell you why. The manganese is essentially a very cheap metal compared to all the other metals, battery metals. As I mentioned before, 47 times cheaper than cobalt, depending obviously on the relation of price between one and the other, because both are fluctuating all the time. But manganese, 10 to 47 times cheaper than cobalt, 4 times cheaper than nickel, many times more cheaper than lithium. So when you look at the cost breakdown of the battery pack in a vehicle, manganese is only accounts for about between 1 and 2% of the cost. So even if the prices of manganese double, from the point of view of the cost of the battery pack, it doesn't make that much difference. So your assumption might be true that the cost of vehicles, of batteries in vehicles, which is the most expensive part of the electric vehicle, they might be rising because of the rise of the materials. And this is already happening. We see it with lithium and cobalt and nickel in particular, but the manganese will not be the culprit. And hence, there will be no reason to engineer manganese out of batteries because it is cheap. Even if it doubles in price, it's still cheap.
Well, let me ask you another question. Suppose we have a war or major geopolitical tensions between the West and the East, or maybe uncertainty in Africa, where a lot of the manganese is produced and mined. Let's suppose supply is cut in some way. What does that mean for the EV industry?
Well, that spells trouble, and this trouble may come from China. And the reason I'm saying this is because today, 90% of the capacity for manganese sulfate production is in China. So, as I said before, the mining production is scattered all over the world, 10 to 15 countries, in South Africa, in Brazil, in Ghana, in Gabon, in Australia. So no problem there. But the processing capacity for the sulfate, which is required for the electric batteries, 90% of it sits in China. So that could be a problem, like with any other things like earth metals and other things which come from China, if we have a rise in political tension. So there are luckily some projects which are outside of China which are being built, but they are not ready yet. There is only one producer of the sulfate outside of China right now.
Okay, well that does sound like a major risk now for the industry. It is concentrated in a few players. So let's talk about how investors can participate. Is there a way to participate in this market besides, I guess, buying an EV? Indirectly, you're investing in manganese because it's in the car.
Right. Well, this is a very obscure corner of manganese market, and manganese as a whole market is not as transparent and like copper or aluminium or even iron. So if you want to buy directly into the metal, your possibilities are limited. But I think the best exposure is through buying shares in companies which are involved in this process. But my advice or my comment here would be, if you are to invest in manganese because you think it has a great future, scrutinize your project very, very closely and see, what is the game plan? Are they going to be selling to the metallurgical industry? And then you are very much at the mercy of steel markets and where the steel market is going, and that's linked to the industrial production and so on, or whether they are targeting specifically the electric vehicles market. And if this is the latter, then probably you may be onto something.
All right. Well, I know you can't give exact price predictions or forecasts, but can you give us an indication of whether or not you think prices may continue to head up or flatline from here, or potentially go back down to January 2021 levels?
There is certainly going to be a lot of volatility in this market. That's a given. And those, as you yourself mentioned, 350% rise since January 2020, 225% rise in 2021. Those are big numbers, and we can see it going up and down by double digits, at a drop of a hat. That's a given. So you have to have strong nerves to withstand that. But generally speaking, we see a massive deficit developing, supply deficit. There are not enough projects. There is a lot of demand. And even if the demand predictions are wrong in terms of they are on the high side, the gap is so huge that even if the demand predictions are just halved, we still have a massive deficit. And just to make your viewers aware how big this deficit is, we are talking about 15 times the global production of manganese sulfate.
Wow.
Demand in 2030. The global production of manganese sulfate needs to rise 15 times to satisfy the demand we expect in 2030. It will rise, and there are projects in the pipeline, and particularly the Chinese are responding vigorously to it. But from what we know today, it will rise 7 times, and it needs to rise 15 times.
But this deficit isn't a problem of lack of reserves, right? There is plenty of manganese in the ground. It just needs to be extracted?
Yes, but that's not a problem either. The problem is in the processing facility, building factories which are converting manganese ore into manganese sulfate of high purity. And I want to stress the word high purity because the battery makers are very choosy. They have a list of up to 17 elements and very strict limits, like 1 parts per million, 5 parts per million, and so on, of impurities they would be willing to accept, no more than that. And it's very difficult to produce a product of such high purity. And that is why it's difficult to build those plants.
Well, you mentioned a few key risks to the automaking industry, specifically with EVs. Now, you mentioned, first of all, this deficit, potential supply crunch out of China, among other things. And it sounds like now there's a lack of infrastructure to process this metal. If I were an EV maker, if I were, let's say, Tesla or a rival, wouldn't I want to be more vertically integrated, perhaps buy a mine, do some production myself, do some refining myself, to eliminate the risk of a supply crunch?
They said they would, all of them, all the 3 I mentioned. If you go back to their battery day, power day, whatever they call their big event once a year when they talk about their plans for the future, they all said they are going to get their hands dirty and they are going to go upstream and they are going to start buying into assets which are up to mining, not just processing, most definitely, yes, but also up to mining projects. We haven't seen many big announcements as yet, but I think there are sort of in the works.
Okay, so we'll watch for that. How likely is it that you think a company like Tesla could own a mine?
Probably for Tesla owning a mine, we will wait a little bit. But for Tesla owning a processing plant producing so-called precursors, meaning the sulfates, that probably we'll see it much sooner.
Okay, excellent. Andrew, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate your thoughts. That was very educational.
Well, I encourage everybody to look at manganese because that's one of the overlooked gems in the arsenal of the battery makers. And CPM Group obviously has a lot of expertise on this.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I appreciate it once again. Thank you. And thank you for watching Kitco News. I'm David Lin. Stay tuned for more and don't forget to subscribe.